Katie, do you want to introduce yourself now or anymore, or do you want to save that till your presentation starts, your part
I'll
starts?
just do it when I start.
Okay, great. All right, so moving on to what questions I hope will answer for you in our time together this afternoon. First of all, I want to give you some working definition of human trafficking. I'm a lawyer, but I want to give you some practical guidance about what human trafficking really means, practically speaking. Then I'm going to unpack the criminal laws that apply to trafficking, which also have a lot of practical implications, I hope, for you as well, and describe how human trafficking can happen in West Virginia. And this is where there'll be some overlap with what Katie and I both discuss, because Katie has really, in all candor, much more practical hands-on interaction and observation of the impact of human trafficking and human trafficking victims than what I ever have through her work at EPIC. And she'll be exploring, I expect, some of her experiences and anecdotes of what she's seen in human trafficking in West Virginia. And then on a related note, and this will be mostly in Katie's wheelhouse as well, we'll talk about how do we identify and respond to victims once we've identified them. Now, first of all, what is human trafficking? If you remember nothing else about what I have to say, I think this is probably the most important thing, and it's a basic definition of human trafficking, and that is compelling another person to provide services, labor, or commercial sex. Now, I've underlined the word compelling on your screen for a reason, and that is that's really where the crux of the definition is. The compulsion aspect of human trafficking is critical to distinguishing it from other either types of crime or even lawful activities. People obviously work. We're working now. We're getting a paycheck. But when you're compelled to do that, that's what turns a legal, normal activity into something that's illegal and can be extraordinarily egregious. By the same token, commercial sex. And when I say commercial sex, that means any transaction involving anything of value in exchange for sex. And it can be, it doesn't have to be money. It can be anything material or immaterial, but something of value in exchange for sex. So commercial sex is illegal in West Virginia. It's not illegal in every state, such as Nevada. And certainly in other parts of the world, it's not illegal either. And we never know if other states will legalize prostitution. Be that as it may, whether it's legal or illegal, the compulsion to provide commercial sex is what distinguishes it from other activities, from other crimes or normal activities, and makes it, again, human trafficking. Now, as that definition suggests, there's two major types of human trafficking: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. I'm going to focus a lot on sex trafficking. I think to some extent Katie will too, because that's the majority of what we see in West Virginia. And the statistics bear that out, both to some extent nationally or to some extent internationally, and certainly nationally. When it comes to law enforcement perspective, about 95% of cases that are prosecuted federally are sex trafficking cases. And then when it comes to reported trafficking cases through our national human trafficking hotline, at least 70 to 75% of victims consistently are identified as sex trafficking victims. At bottom, human trafficking is a modern day form of slavery. It's not the kind of slavery that we have conceptualized over time and that has plagued the country in its first 100 years of existence, that involved shackles and chains. But and nowadays it's a much more psychological, manipulative form of slavery oftentimes. There's a lot of myths that are associated with human trafficking, a lot of misconceptions of what does or does not constitute human trafficking. I want to review a few of those briefly. And these are all things that actually could be signs of human trafficking, but are not human trafficking in and of themselves. First of all, illegal child adoption. Someone gets a child from Russia or Africa, for example, and does not go through the proper governmental um, channels to do so. That's not human trafficking. That could constitute other crimes, but it's not human trafficking. Alien smuggling. This is a very common misconception about human trafficking. Human trafficking does not require the movement of one person from one country to another. In fact, human trafficking can be something that occurs exclusively in your neighbor's house. Child pornography. Child pornography, again, is sometimes used as part of human trafficking, but in and of itself is not human trafficking. Garden variety adult prostitution is another one. Again, I say garden variety because it doesn't involve that compulsion element that I highlighted earlier. And it's what we typically think of when we think of prostitution. That's not human trafficking in and of itself. Labor violations. Again, some might signal human trafficking, but because someone's not paid minimum wage or maybe working under poor labor conditions, it doesn't mean that they're being trafficked. And by the same token, poor living conditions. Again, once again, it could be a sign of human trafficking, but not human trafficking in and of itself. Now, moving on from some basics about what human trafficking is and is not, let me talk about more statistically broadly of what human trafficking looks like from a numerical standpoint, at least. It is an international epidemic. By some measures, by some authorities, indicate that human trafficking is the second fastest growing crime in the world, next only to drugs. But it has a local impact in a very real and tangible way, as we'll see from the numbers and also we'll explore in the presentation. When it comes to the business of trafficking, it's big enough to be its own country. According to the International Labor Organization, there's more than 40 million victims of human trafficking worldwide, and that the business itself of human trafficking produces up to $150 billion in annual profits. In the United States, more specifically, just when it comes to the raw numbers of human trafficking, these stats bear out kind of the growing trends of human trafficking situations or cases, depending on how the Polaris Project or Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline has defined them over the years. The increases of those categories over the years. In 2012, the Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline, that's the main 800 hotline that people call to report human trafficking cases, or to identify victims, or to report themselves as victims, or to learn more information about human trafficking. In 2012, there was a little over 3,400 cases identified by the hotline. By 2019, that number had more than tripled to 11,500 human trafficking situations now. A few other notable statistics from the 2019 set of data that I thought I would share would be that 70% of the identified victims were sex trafficked. Again, this is very consistent with historical data that we've seen both from the hotline and other sources. The average age of a human trafficking victim when victimized is 17 years of age for sex trafficking victims and 22 years old for labor trafficking. And there's been a growing family recruitment trend when it comes to how victims are introduced into human trafficking. Consistently over the past few years, and certainly in West Virginia from what we've seen and heard anecdotally, it is very common for victims to be introduced into trafficking by family members, from parents to aunts, uncles, brothers, and others in the family who are facilitating this crime. And then in 2019, excuse me, the hotline data indicated that there was 93 likely trafficking victims that were identified in West Virginia in that year. Now, you don't have to look far to see nationally that human trafficking is very tangible and very real. In addition to these statistics, you can look at court cases and news reports indicating that human trafficking is pervasive. that it's being prosecuted, that it's being committed in every corner of the United States. Just in the past couple months, I pulled a few headlines. One here is that prominent Virginia, excuse me, Democrat lawyer was busted for trafficking teenage girls. That's from November, last November. Just in the past 2 days, there was a man in Dayton, Ohio arrested for human trafficking. There just yesterday, there was a bust in Southern California where 33 missing children were rescued as part of a human trafficking operation. And also yesterday, wife of a pastor in Michigan was arraigned on human trafficking and sexual assault charges. So this crime cuts across the spectrum when it comes to geography, when it comes to economics and socioeconomic status, and it certainly is prevalent or present here as well. Now, when it comes to children in particular, the risk and the vulnerability of children is uniquely high when it comes to trafficking, and especially as it relates to runaways. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, 1 in 7 endangered runaways are likely to be trafficked, and almost 90% of those folks, those children, were in foster care or social services, and that's a consistent theme when it comes to the vulnerabilities in children and others really as well that we see, is that for those that have lack of residential stability or runaways, there's enormous vulnerability for trafficking there. This statistic is particularly concerning in West Virginia when you consider that runaway numbers in West Virginia have been increasing dramatically in recent years. I don't have the numbers from 2020, nor do I have the numbers from the full numbers from 2019, but from this article from 2019, it indicated that 791 runaways were identified in West Virginia in 2018. And as of September of 2019, there was more than 651 runaways identified. So using the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children statistic of 1 in 7 runaways likely to be trafficked, you're looking at in both of those years, upwards of 100 or more children in West Virginia, runaway children who were trafficked. Those, at least, are the implications of those statistics. Excuse me. Now, moving on to more of the nuts and bolts of the laws that we apply and that govern the prosecution and enforcement of anti-trafficking. First of all, talking about federal law, this is my wheelhouse. I'm a prosecutor in the Northern District of West Virginia, which you see on the left, but I have a counterpart, Jennifer Harrell, for those of you that might be in the Charleston area, who is the point of contact for anti-trafficking in the Southern District of West Virginia. So the areas that you see, that's the extent of our geographic coverage, as opposed to just a county prosecutor who is confined to the boundaries of their counties. Now, when it comes to federal law, the two main statutes that we apply to prosecute trafficking coincide with the two types of trafficking that I identified earlier: labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Now, for both, the elements of the crimes are very straightforward. They follow along what we call the AMP model for short, which stands for action, means, purpose, each letter and each word representing another element. The first aspect of trafficking is the action. That's some means of conduct to engage a victim. It can involve recruiting them, transporting them, patronizing them, or soliciting them, among other things. And then the second element, which is really the most important, as I'll explain, is the means. That is the application of that compulsion element that I described earlier, which is in federal law and largely in state law, albeit worded differently, is force, fraud, or coercion. Force, fraud, or coercion. And then the final element is purpose, the purpose for which the force, fraud, or coercion is applied. And that is either for commercial sex acts or labor or services. Now, examples of force. So when we talk about force, fraud, or coercion, what do we mean by that? And when it comes to those legal definitions of how this compulsion is applied. Well, force is pretty self-explanatory. It's the application of physical power. It can be manifested in a physical assault or sexual assault, by restraint or confinement, by some kind of almost imprisonment type of situation, someone locked in a room, someone shackled, although like I said, that's much less common than what people might think. Starvation, the withholding of food or nourishment, and the forcible administration of drugs and alcohol. Those are examples of the application of force. Now, fraud. What are examples of fraud? Fraud is just legal jargon for deception. Deception. So in the context of trafficking, what are examples of fraud? Deceptive offers of employment is a common mode of fraud in both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. A romance scam. Romance scam often looks like an individual who is trying to woo a young woman who might have some emotional vulnerabilities of her own, and develops a romantic relationship with her, wins her trust, buys gifts for her, tells her that he's going to take care of her, and then once the relationship evolves, it gets more committed and intimate. The man oftentimes in this situation will turn the tables and say that he's fallen on hard luck, and that he needs her to sell herself sexually in order to make money for them to survive, and that's a very prototypical form of a romance scam. Another example of fraud, especially in the labor trafficking context, there's false assurances regarding immigration status. This might occur in an ethnic restaurant, for example, where the owner of the ethnic restaurant is recruiting laborers from out of country, and as an incentive for workers coming to work for the owner, they will offer out or hold out the prospect of getting a green card or some legal status in the United States if they complete so many months of work. And when that time period expires, lo and behold, that status is not in fact an option or offered. And then sometimes the owner will threaten to deport or report the employees to immigration if they decide not to continue working for them at some abysmally low rate of pay. General promises of a better life. It can be as simple as that. Just a trafficker deceiving his victim or her victim to believe that if they do what they ask, be it for labor or commercial sex, then their circumstances will improve. That would be an example of fraud. Now, third and final example of means or a idea of coercion, or excuse me, compulsion, is coercion. Coercion in this context is a psychological manipulation of someone's vulnerability in most circumstances. And so in the context of trafficking, it could look like threats to the victim or their family or friends, or blackmail, extortion. This is a very common tact of traffickers. Induced drug addiction. One of the first cases, most significant cases in this context, in trafficking cases and prosecutions federally, was a case from Florida where a biker guy developed a relationship with strippers who had obviously sordid backgrounds, in their past, but they didn't have drug addictions. And he developed a relationship with a dirty doctor in Florida, got a steady stream of opioid pills, and got them hooked on opioids. And he would also get pills, amphetamines, from the doctor, and use kind of a cocktail of opioids or amphetamines and to get them addicted. And also when they had he would prostitute them in order to make money for himself. And he manipulated them through their drug addiction to do so. And this case went to trial, and one of the victims testified that she was suffering from severe withdrawal symptoms, which, for those of you in the medical community will know, can be debilitating physiologically and psychologically. And she was on her hands and knees physically begging for another pill, and the trafficker was holding it above her like a treat to a dog, and told her that he would give her that pill if she would turn more tricks for him. And that's one prominent example from the cases. But this idea of induced drug addiction, we think that in the law enforcement community and the service provider community, this may be one of the most common forms of coercion to get people to traffic people, particularly young women in sex trafficking contexts. Another form of coercion is threatened abuse of legal process. And again, this is the idea of someone has a vulnerability, like they may be late on their rent, and a landlord threatens to kick them out if it's a ownership situation, foreclosing their mortgage, or have them evicted from their apartment. And they threaten this legal process, whether they're justified in doing so or not, in order to apply pressure, to coerce, compel someone to engage in commercial sex, labor, or services in a situation they ordinarily would not do so. So that's another form of coercion. And surveillance and monitoring is one of many other examples that I could share. And that is simply the idea that when someone is monitoring your actions and watching you closely, it has a psychological impact. And you tend to think things that may not even exist in terms of your situation that could compel you to do something you wouldn't otherwise do. Now, these are all examples, again, of force, fraud, and coercion, and those apply to situations involving adults for either sex or labor trafficking. The calculus changes a little bit, however, when we're involving minors and sex trafficking. When we involve minors, we don't have to show that there's force, fraud, or coercion applied. And the reason why is that as minors, there's a legal disability, so to speak, as we say in the law, that they don't have the capacity to consent. So we don't have to show that they were compelled. So therefore, all we have to show to establish sex trafficking of a minor is that there's some action to engage them, and for the purpose of commercial sex acts. So soliciting them is sex trafficking. Soliciting a minor for prostitution or commercial sex is sex trafficking. Advertising them is the same thing. So any of these actions for the purpose of commercial sex for a minor is sex trafficking. And this underscores the idea that there's no such thing as an idea that I want to emphasize to you, is there's no such thing as a child prostitute. Anytime we're involving minors and sex, commercial sex, that's sex trafficking. It's not prostitution. It's not a crime by the child. It's a crime by the person who's soliciting or obtaining the sex. When it comes to federal cases, and I'll just skim over this, there's an idea that there's a requirement, I should say, jurisdictionally, that we have to prove there's some interstate nexus involved for us to prove a federal crime. And there's a variety of ways that we can do that. internet, credit cards, interstate travel, significant commercial activity, that we have to show that for. Just as a FYI. By the same token, a few other footnotes for when we are involving minors. You may ask, well, how do we prove that, or do we have to prove that traffickers actually knew that they were dealing with a minor when you're dealing with sex trafficking in minors? Well, we don't. We only have to prove that the traffickers have a reasonable opportunity to observe the victim, which I kind of refer to as the light of day rule. If a trafficker sees a victim in the light of day, then I think that suffices to be a reasonable opportunity to observe them. And as I've alluded as well, customers can be prosecuted for trafficking, and investors can be prosecuted for trafficking as well, just on the same level as people who have trafficked in other ways more directly. When it comes to penalties for human trafficking on the federal side, they're very stiff. For sex trafficking, it's a mandatory minimum of 10 years and up to life as a maximum punishment. And for labor trafficking, it's up to life if there's some kind of force or death that results. And then also it's 20 years if there's no such aggravating factor in play. Now, when it comes to, so that concludes the federal anti-trafficking law. Quickly touch on the state law. The state law is different in some respects than the federal law, but in essence, the elements, the core aspects of it are the same. It's worded differently. The laws are lengthier in terms of its text, so I won't unpack that for you. But there's similar definitions of human trafficking. They categorize them differently. They refer to them by different names. Instead of just simply sex trafficking, labor trafficking, the trafficking categories in the statute are debt bondage, forced labor, and sexual servitude. And as I kind of alluded earlier in saying that there's no such thing as a child prostitute, there's legal immunity for minor sex trafficking victims who in a previous era would have been referred to as child prostitutes. So they cannot be prosecuted for prostitution crime is the implication of that statute. And there's also expungement for prostitution convictions. This is kind of on the other side of the equation where folks have been convicted of prostitution crimes in the past, but who are in fact trafficked before the state code existed, which is relatively new. It's only a few years old. They can go back to the court and say, you know what? They can basically swear under oath and describe the circumstances that led them to their prostitution, and explain that it was actually trafficking instead. And if the court is convinced of that, then the court can expunge their prostitution conviction, which I think is a tremendous victim-centered development. A couple other laws of interest to you and your circle and your profession is that sex offender registration now encompasses sexual servitude convictions. So if you're convicted of basically a sex trafficking offense in West Virginia, you have to sign up for sex offender registration. And also an abused child under the child welfare reporting law now includes a child who is or could be trafficked as well. Now, when it comes to the punishment for state human trafficking offenses, the punishment are not quite as severe as federal offenses, but they're still very significant, ranging from a mandatory minimum of at least 1 year and up to 20 years, depending on the age of the victim and the circumstances of the offense. Just a few final key points relating to the differences between federal and state law is that federal law violation generally is a state law violation, but not necessarily vice versa. That federal sex trafficking can also be proven by fraud, with fraud as that coercion element or that compulsion element. That's not necessarily the case in state law. And that federal sex trafficking, on the other hand, requires proof of this interstate nexus. and that federal trafficking, as you saw, results in higher penalties for the offenders. Now that's the legal piece of the presentation. Now I'm going to cover what human trafficking looks like in West Virginia, explaining some of the risk factors that we have that are unique in West Virginia that make us vulnerable to trafficking, and also the areas in which trafficking may occur, that you might see it. So first of all, the risk factors for trafficking. These are commonsensical, and they all relate to the vulnerability of the population. So you have high poverty areas in West Virginia. We have pervasive drug problems, which you all know. What you may not know or may not appreciate as much is that we are in close proximity to high trafficking areas where there's high incidence of human trafficking problems. And we have a growing transient population, although albeit now it's for a variety of reasons, COVID, economics, etc. It's less significant now as it has been in the past, but a transient population, for whatever it's worth, is often associated with a risk factor for trafficking. And also when it comes to risk in West Virginia, as it relates to trafficking and other forms of crimes, especially for those who are coming out of state to commit them, there is a perceived low risk for traffickers to commit these crimes. I would venture to say because of the more rural nature of our state, lack of urban areas, and easier means of kind of escaping attention because of that. Now, when it comes to the fact that we're surrounded by areas of high trafficking incidents, this map reflects that visually. This is a heat map drawn from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline and the volume of calls that they've gotten over a period of time. I can't remember the time frame this covers, but it covers at least several years in the 2012, 2018 vicinity. And what you see here is that there's this blank spot, by and large, comparatively speaking, where West Virginia is compared to the other areas. You have DC, Pittsburgh area, Ohio, Virginia, and Kentucky, all of which have relatively high rates of human trafficking, interestingly enough. And that data is shown by this chart. This is from the 2017 hotline data, and it reflects that that all the states that border us have at least above average human trafficking rates. Ohio is fourth, at least was fourth in the country in terms of that data. Pennsylvania was 10th, Virginia was 14th, Maryland was 20th, and Kentucky was 21st. So that is a macroscopic perspective of the nature of the risk involved in other areas surrounding us. In fact, even more anecdotally beyond that, law enforcement have received reports from sister agencies in Ohio and Maryland, for example, that they have seen historically West Virginia residents that were basically shipped out and were identified as trafficking victims in those states and other states. And I think that that's something that we can expect to see more of as well. And Katie might be able to speak to that. Now, kind of drilling down a little bit more practically as far as where you might see trafficking in your communities and neighborhoods, what I call high traffic areas. I'll start first of all with internet classified ads. This is really where a lot of sex trafficking in particular is thriving and bridging out, and this is kind of the location of a lot of human trafficking historically And it's really the driving force, I think, today too. It's hard to get a handle of in terms of where it is now. It started out really with Backpage. And for those of you who are not familiar, Backpage is like Craigslist, like this, except for whatever reason, it became the local locus, the focal point of sex trafficking advertisement nationally. So much so that it got shut down, it got prosecuted criminally because it was blatantly being used for sex trafficking to facilitate sex trafficking. And so the page no longer exists. It's been completely shut down. But that clientele, those traffickers, really just moved on to other sources, other locations, and ventured out and started new classified ad sites, some of which are even more explicit than Backpage was. So it's developed tentacles all over the internet, and it's evolving as we speak. However, I think it is worthwhile to kind of see, to get a glimpse of what one of these ads might look like, or what they do look like. And I draw here from a couple old Backpage ads that really were posted in West Virginia several years ago now. Here's one from 2013, August of 2013, from the Wheeling area. And as you see on your screen, it says, you've got a picture of a young woman in the bottom right-hand part of the screen. And the text of it says that I love to have fun and enjoying all my friends. I'm slim, I'm 5'8", and my bra is a B cup. If you want to have a blast with a cool, sexy, slim black girl, call my line to know more. She gives her phone number and says, let's go and do what we want. Now, and it's at the location and indicates is Northern Panhandle, Wheeling, St. Clairsville. If you were to click on this enlarged picture, or it would give you this picture and other pictures, and here's what it would show. And I asked the question somewhat rhetorically, is she really 18 years old? Well, she might be 18 years old. It's true. She does not look 18 to me, at least on the surface. And to the extent that she is, it still begs the question, well, why is she posting this ad online? What would lead her to do that? If she's not 18, if she hasn't reached that age, then anyone's answering this ad and soliciting her for sex is guilty of human trafficking. If she is 18 or older, then the questions that I have, to the extent they're answerable, may reflect that she's being trafficked, that someone is actually pimping her out, or that she's doing this under some kind of coercive element. Now, another ad in the same time frame, interestingly, that I found Backpage from 2013, indicated there was Russian girl massages in West Virginia. Who knew? And in this ad, it said it was for a limited time only, that there was going to be Russian girl massages in town for a week in August. And it said, come check out our latest Russian girls, now taking appointments, massage only, smiley face, book now. And it basically gave locations statewide. Now, if you look at this young lady's picture on the bottom right hand of the screen, you'll see that her hair obscures the word on her shirt, which would say sex. So that's one small clue, perhaps, of what this really is intended to advertise. Now, if you were to click on the enlarged picture, you would see that maybe that this was not only for massage, but maybe so. Maybe these Russian ladies were really good at working the kinks out of folks' necks, but maybe they provided other services that were not fully listed. Regardless, there's a lot of questions that this would cause you to ask. One is, are these girls really Russian? And if so, how did they get here? Are they here legally? And where are they going next? Where have they been? Where are they staying? And of course, are they providing just massages, or in fact, are they providing commercial sex? So internet classified ads, that covers a huge swath of where sex trafficking is facilitated and where it starts. It also occurs very rampantly in social media, and any social media platform you can imagine, it's there in some form or another. Domestic work. This relates to labor trafficking. Again, we're talking about the different areas where trafficking may manifest itself. Domestic work is much more commonly associated with labor trafficking. It does. We have many examples over the years of labor trafficking cases prosecuted associated with domestic workers. One interesting example that I've learned about over the years is a domestic worker from the Philippines was recruited to work in Wisconsin for two Filipino doctors in Wisconsin. They placed this young lady in the basement of their house and prohibited her from leaving the basement most of the time. When she had a free time, she was allowed to go into their yard on occasion, but most of the time when she wasn't working in the house, she was confined to the basement of their house and had to use a bucket for her bathroom. And she was there for a matter of years. She was working under these circumstances before she was thankfully freed by law enforcement, and the doctors were prosecuted. But these doctors were ordinary people, at least from outward appearances. They had neighbors, people who were completely oblivious to the fact that they had basically a slave working for them in their basement. Beyond that, massage parlors. This is a common location of sex trafficking. Unfortunately, this is not to say all massage parlors are sex trafficking hubs. They're not, but they do. We have seen a tendency for these types of institutions to be associated with sex trafficking. And if you haven't checked, there's one in virtually every somewhat larger town in West Virginia. One example of this is, and I saw this website years ago. It's now membership and password protected. You have to pay to access it now, which I think says something in and of itself. It's called Rub Maps, Find Your Happy Ending, which gives you a couple clues right there. And this is, again, several years ago. It advertised these massage parlors, and the ratings that you see are given by folks who obviously use the services there. And oftentimes, the basis of the ratings is whether or not there's some sexual service that's provided at the massage parlor as well. And so people that's what they're seeking, they'll pay for access to this site and other sites like it, and look at the reviews and see if they can get commercial sex at one of these massage parlors. This one in particular I've highlighted is in Charleston, and it's a 4-star review average and $60 per hour for cash for Asian massage, so it says. Another common location of human trafficking, sex trafficking in particular, is truck stops. This has historically been a place where there's been prostitution associated with truck stops. And so, not surprisingly, sex trafficking is something that also occurs at truck stops as well. I'll show you a video, if it works, hopefully, that reflects that as an example. But that's another place where we have lots of incidents of sex trafficking that have been identified as at truck stops. This where you have men who are transient and are not attached to the place where they're stopping oftentimes, and that are by themselves, create a market, unfortunately, for prostitution and therefore for sex trafficking. Strip clubs. Never been to a strip club, don't care to go to one. So this is the best that I can do by way of illustration. Picture of the Simpsons and Nelson's mom at the Classic Girl Strip Club. And any sexually oriented business like a strip club is going to be associated with prostitution oftentimes, and therefore it could be a place for sex trafficking as well. There have been cases that have been prosecuted related to sex trafficking out of strip clubs. Casinos, where you have a lot of cash, discretionary cash thrown about, and folks who are maybe thrill seeking, whatever. It creates a market for sex trafficking and prostitution as well, in a similar, but I think common sense, or different but common sense vein. So casinos is a place that we have seen sex trafficking. Traveling sales crews. This is something that may surprise a lot of you. Traveling sales crews are one of the growing areas and actually more common areas nowadays that we see of labor trafficking violations. We've all had, I think, traveling sales crew members, young high school age, college age kids knock on your door who are selling magazines or cleaning products, for example, on some kind of a commission basis. That is not illegal in and of itself. However, these sales crew kids are sometimes exploited and then trafficked in situations where they are far away from home, and their managers cut them off from communications with their family or friends. They may stockpile them, throw them all in one big hotel room, threaten them with harm or not paying or extorting them in other ways if they don't meet certain quotas. And so, interestingly, traveling sales crews have been associated with some labor trafficking activities in recent years. Other trafficking hotspots, which may again seem commonsensical, migrant labor, ethnic restaurants, nail salons, all these areas, there have been both labor trafficking and sex trafficking associated with them, and there have been criminal cases brought in those areas. No matter what area, though, that we talk about at bottom, the focal point of a trafficker, the reason why really I think trafficking can get any traction or can exist is the exploitation of vulnerability. That's what trafficking in essence is the exploitation of some victim's vulnerability, that either their poverty, their drug addiction, their lack of stability at home, their needs for medical care or mental health treatment, whatever the case may be. There's some vulnerability there that a trafficker can exploit in order to get them to do something they wouldn't ordinarily do. And I think that while we can categorize a lot of risk factors associated with traffickers or trafficking victims and give you lots of schema or matrices to kind of help identify trafficking, really that's in essence what it boils down to. Now, kind of as I kind of finish up my segment and get ready for Katie's much more engaging part of the presentation, I want to show you a video illustrating what the example of one victim looks like, one victim's story, which kind of drives home a lot of the points I think I've made about what trafficking looks like and where it can occur. So hopefully this video will play for you and you'll hear it fine. Let me know, chat, please send a chat if it doesn't.
We can't hear it. Is there sound yet? There might not be sound yet.
Okay. So can no one hear it?
When you go to share, before you share, there's a little box at the bottom that says share computer audio. Click that and then click on your file and click share.
Okay, so I'm looking. Okay, share computer sound. There we go.
In the United States. Between 2003 and
Everybody hear
2007,
that?
working out of Oklahoma City, the FBI conducted the first widespread human trafficking operation in the United States. Operation Stormy Nights resulted in the conviction of 15 pimps and human traffickers working throughout the American Midwest. Most of the traffickers' victims were young teenage girls.
We pull up at a truck stop, and it's like an alley just right on the other side of this fence. He tells us to get out. He tells us what kind of prices we're gonna charge and exactly what we're gonna do. My friend just kind of looks at me, and she's kind of preparing me with her eyes, and then I was just kind of like, I can help you if you help me, and maybe he won't kill us tonight. So we get out of the car, and he informed us we better not come back without any money. We're walking around, there's lots of semis, and there's also a lot of girls out there, and a lot of them are just, they look like half our age. They look like they could be like 8 or 9 years old. So we go and we're knocking on doors, and we just try to keep smiling, just try to pretend that I wanted to be there, and maybe I could just convince myself that maybe this will lead to something better, and maybe I'm seeing it wrong. And once we got inside the bed of the truck, I started to just wish I was just dead or something. We get in the first truck, and the guy decides he wants me. So I go back there, and, I just have to just pray to God, just please help me. Just please let me get through it. And then Melissa went through his wallet, and he had grandkids as old as us. And all I could think about the whole time was how my grandpa could be this guy right now, and how that would feel. And I just wanted to die.
Angie, for the most part, came through her tragedy. She's got her feet on the ground, and she's moving forward, wanting to help people, and has a story that I think represents well what the nation is facing when we look at these kids that are being trafficked domestically right here on our own land.
So that story has always been pretty profound to me on lots of levels, and I think it's a tremendous illustration of what trafficking looks like and what it could look like in West Virginia in particular. I mean, that young lady easily kind of fits the mold of a young girl that I think we would see in West Virginia on so many levels, and it hits on a lot of the risk factors that we talked about. Runaways, and for example, and interaction with truck stops. So when we talk about exploiting vulnerabilities, a lot of other vulnerabilities are again commonsensical. They've been either referenced or alluded to by much of what I've talked about thus far. But just to quickly recap some common victim vulnerabilities from the statistics of human trafficking victims are minor females, those with a history of physical or sexual abuse, substance dependency issues, poverty, runaway or homeless, foster care involvement. On this note, I'll just add that there's reports and I think investigations involving folks who have actually deliberately worked in the foster care system to recruit potential trafficking victims, if not even becoming foster care parents themselves, traffickers becoming foster care parents. So that's a huge vulnerability in the system, unfortunately. Disabilities and immigrant status, some of the most common, but by no means exclusive victim vulnerabilities. Now with that, I'll do a quick stop share. and just say I'm going to transition to Katie, and but wanted to just thank you for your attendance really quickly, and I'll have a chance to talk at the end. That concludes my part of the presentation, substantive presentation, and we'll have opportunities to answer questions that you might have later. But really appreciate your engagement and look forward to reconnecting at the end of the presentation. Katie, do you want me to share the screen from me, or do you want to share your own?
Oh, no, I can do it.
Okay.
I even have it. There we go. And that's the slide you ended on, right?
Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. Well, then I exit out of it. That was great. Okay. So thank you for starting us off. And then it started me. Hold on. Let me get right to the right slide again. I'm Katie Spriggs. I'm the executive director at Eastern Panhandle Empowerment Center, which is actually in the Eastern Panhandle, as you could imagine. And we serve Berkeley, Morgan, and Jefferson counties, so like the easternmost panhandle. And we are a dual program, which is a term you'll hear later in the presentation. But basically what that means is in West Virginia, in like domestic violence, sexual assault, victim service provider world, we have two types of programs. We have a dual program, which is a program that serves both sexual assault and domestic violence survivors under the same program. And then we have standalone programs. Those are across the state. There's a couple areas where there's a sexual assault program and there's a DV program, and they are separate. Separate nonprofits that operate separately but refer back and forth. So we do both at EPIC. We serve survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, human trafficking, and dating violence. We added how we, and specifically me, got into the human trafficking world. In 2012, I had just started, so I've been there, it'll be 9 years this year. I started as a senior in college. I hadn't even graduated yet, and with my social work degree, and I was a sexual assault victim advocate. And we got a hotline call on like a Friday afternoon. And it was the Polaris, which is the organization based in the United States out of DC that runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So they called us, they called our hotline, and they were like, hi, it's Polaris. And we have a survivor of sex trafficking who is going to be trafficked in your area in Martinsburg over the weekend. And we were wondering if she could come into your shelter. And, you know, I was like 21 years old and so fresh out of college. And I just truly didn't know. And I was like, I mean, yeah, this sounds like something we should help with. So sure. And so began a very long weekend. So then Saturday came around, and the plan as of Friday was they will call us Saturday and coordinate, like, you know, how are we getting her, where is she coming from, things like that. So at this point, keep in mind, we haven't even talked to her directly yet, to the survivor. We were assuming it was a female survivor. So I was answering the hotline on Saturday too, and they called in the morning, and they said she's staying at this hotel. I don't know if anyone, I'm going to stop sharing just for a second so I can see the chat easier. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the Martinsburg area, but give me some guesses as to like what type of hotel you would imagine someone would be trafficked in. You can chat it or you can unmute and say it. Okay, we got a Motel 6 guess. Motel, thinking the same thing. So yeah, like in Martinsburg, we had like...
Isn't a Red Roof Inn?
Red Roof Inn, good guess. We have a Red Roof Inn. Somebody guessed Garden, Nights Inn. Ooh, whoever said Nights Inn, you know Martinsburg. Super 8, yeah, yep, you got it. So it was the Holiday Inn, which if you've ever come to Martinsburg, like for a conference, that's probably where you stayed. That's where most people stay when they're coming in for like professional, especially at that time, we didn't have the hotel that's at the Commons, if you know Martinsburg, and we didn't have the Hilton, the one that's right next to Comfort or Holiday Inn right now. There's two right there. But before, we pretty much just had like Hampton Inn and Holiday Inn and then like motels. So the first part of this story that actually surprised me was that they said, yeah, she's being trafficked at Holiday Inn. And I was like, okay. She was texting them. So the survivor was communicating with their hotline via text, and then they were communicating with me over the phone. So still at this point, hadn't talked to her directly. And so it was really hard because it was like a third person, and it would take her a while to answer because of course she was like sneaking the text messages when she went to the bathroom. So over the course of the day, we had about 20 plans that failed. It was like 10 o'clock in the morning, and then that didn't work. And then it was 11, and then it was 12. And then it just kind of kept getting pushed back, and the plan kept failing. She was very adamant that she did not want to involve law enforcement at this part in the game. So we respected that. And we were coordinating with like a local taxi company to pick her up, which there were many parts of this story that you're going to be like, wow, you guys, you really didn't have it, because we did not have it. So was a taxi a good idea? Absolutely not. Now, 2021, we have an agency van. So we would have just gone and gotten her in the van, and it would have been so much easier than this debacle. But finally we got a time, and it was dark. I just remember that it was dark. So it was like 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening by this point. And she was like, okay. She was texting the hotline, I'm ready. I'm going outside right now. She had made up some ruse to get a few minutes away from the trafficker. By this point, we don't know this at the time, but we find out later, she had been trafficked with this certain individual for years by this point. So he had kind of grown to trust her. So she was allowed to have a little bit of leeway. And she was, taking a walk or getting ice or whatever. So she's like, I'm ready. So I call the taxi, who I had been communicating with, remember, for like 12 hours. So I'm like, okay, now's the time, like go. So they go, and the survivor's texting the hotline and saying, there's no taxi here. And I'm calling the taxi, and the taxi says, I'm here. And the taxi went to the wrong hotel. Remember I said there's only Hampton or Holiday Inn? They went to Hampton. And if you live in Martinsburg, you know where Holiday Inn is. So it was very astounding. So when I figured out where they were, called them, and I gave them directions to the Holiday Inn that you're right is on the same street as the Hampton. And they eventually got there. So it was like a wild, 10 minutes between the time that we were expecting her to be picked up and the time she successfully was picked up. So brought her to the shelter from the Holiday Inn. She got there, got settled. It's like, okay. So the next day would have been Sunday. And still to this day, that is the longest over the course of a day that it's taken to arrange like a pickup of a survivor, even including domestic violence survivors. Like usually once they're ready to leave and we're set, it can happen pretty quickly. But this was just such like, high energy and so many working pieces that it was the longest still to this day that it took to coordinate that. So I was very invested in this case at this point. So I went to the shelter on Sunday, and I wanted to meet this survivor, particularly check in, make sure she was okay. So by this point, keep in mind, I had only had like one very short communication with her. She had called me when she made it to the shelter just to say like, I made it safely, I'm here. So still, I truly knew nothing about her. So walk into the shelter, I'm asking like, where is she? Give me her room number. I knock on her door, and I open up the door, and she's there. So describe to me what you're thinking she looks like. I already gave it away that she's a she, so you got that. Young, okay. What's her race? What are you thinking? Young, thin, okay. Oriental, middle-aged, Caucasian. All our guesses. So Sarah, you're the closest. She was indeed middle-aged and she was indeed Caucasian. She was 35 years old. She was white. Average height, average build, kind of just overall average. And when I walked in and connected eyes with her, she immediately started cussing. And she was just kind of like, where the F is it? And she was searching for something while cursing. And I was just like, hello, happy Sunday. Where's what? And she told me that her makeup palette had been stolen and it was some name brand. And I get my makeup like buy two, get two free at Ulta. So I had no idea what, I was just like, I don't know what you're talking about. Ends up, we find it. It was not stolen. It was just lost. It was located, crisis averted. So that was kind of our first interaction. So then over the course of the next, couple weeks, we talk. So her story is truly just so indicative of what we see in West Virginia, even though it didn't originate in West Virginia. So, and by the way, parts of the story have been changed just so that it does not give away any personal identifying information. I feel like I should have said that in the beginning, but that was real. So she had grown up in rural Florida, north central Florida. So she didn't even live necessarily on a coast. I mean, you kind of always live on a coast in Florida, but she was a couple hours from a coast. She had never in her life left the state of Florida, which doesn't seem possible to us when, in West Virginia, especially in the Panhandle, we go to the grocery store and we cross through two states. Like, I could throw a rock and hit Maryland and Pennsylvania from my house. So it seems kind of crazy to think that she never left the state of Florida, but my mother, if able, would never leave the state of West Virginia. So it makes sense in that realm. So she had never left the state. She had grown up in borderline abusive, definitely neglectful home with an abusive, her father was abusive to her mother. So she grew up witnessing domestic violence. She got married when she was 16 and had a child when she was 17, and her husband was abusive. So she also experienced domestic violence through most of the course of her adult life. So she had the child very young. She only had one child. She did work growing up. She was a teller at a local bank. Her child went off to college, when she was 33, 34. And she was in her mid 30s. And when her child went off to college, she divorced her abusive husband. So all of this was happening at once in her life. And it was, very refreshing. She was getting a new start. She left her abusive husband. Her kid was off at college. So, she was very excited. This would have been the first generation in forever in their family to go to college. So she was so proud of her child. So she decides to take a vacation. Our client here. So she's taking her first real vacation. I mean, they had taken vacations to the coast and stuff, but her first real vacation. And she decides that she wants to come to DC. She had an aunt that lived in Reston, and she had never been to the nation's capital. So she wanted to come see all the sights. But just like my mother, she was afraid to fly. My mom to this day still has not flown on an airplane. She freaks out when I fly on an airplane. So she was like, I'm not flying. I will take a train. So our client here, gets on a train, and she's going to Washington, D.C. from Florida. So we know that that's quite the train ride. When she arrives, it's about 5:05, 5:15 on a Friday evening in D.C. What's happening at 5 p.m. on a Friday in D.C.?
Rush hour.
Rush hour. You called it. So she said that she knew, because as soon as she's telling the story, I was like, "Oh, rush hour," and she was like, "Yeah." So she had experienced rush hour in her small town, Florida, and I could relate it very similarly to if anyone's ever been to Shepherdstown, West Virginia. They have a 4-way stop sign, and at about 4:30, 5 o'clock, it becomes rush minute. And it takes you, about 10 minutes to get through that 4-way stop sign. So I equated it. She's probably experienced that. So she thought she knew what a rush hour was. So she was like, I knew that it was going to be worse. I had seen it in movies. I knew. She was like, but I didn't.
Oh, sorry.
She was like, I didn't know that it would strand me at the train station for hours. So she's on the train and meets a friend. It's a female friend. They kind of just like, you know, commiserate over how terrible the train ride is. When they get to the DC station, they're both waiting on their rides. And to this day, my number one question about this case is, why didn't her aunt warn her? Like, you live in Reston, you know what rush hour looks like. So she's waiting on her aunt to get to her. And so this other person is waiting on their ride too. So they're kind of like waiting and talking and commiserating. And this gentleman sits down, middle-aged, kind of average, sits down with them, and he starts, you know, complaining like, oh my God, I'm stuck here. My brother's coming to get me, blah, blah, blah. Who do you think out of the three of them, whose ride arrives first? Come on, this is an easy one. The man, good guess. His brother arrives first. So his solution is, well, why don't you just go ahead and ride with us out of the city? We're going the same direction. Call your ride and tell them we'll meet them somewhere else, whatever. So all of us are thinking, don't do it, right? Like, for one, I mean, our context is a little bit different. We're learning about a human trafficking scenario. But we're all like, no. So in reflection, she said, I thought about the potential dangerousness of the situation, but I thought about the fact that I have a friend, I have my partner, like, you know, they say you travel in pairs and that's how you stay safe. And they were exhausted and they were hungry. So they did it. They accepted the ride. So they get in the truck and they, you know, start talking, whatever, and kind of, you know, talking about some of their vulnerabilities that they might experience. And, eventually, through a long series of discussion, she starts to feel like things are maybe taking too long. Like, why haven't we gotten to the meetup point yet? Whatever. And starts to kind of like hint at the fact that she would like to, you know, be dropped off somewhere. And that's when the situation kind of takes a turn and they're like, no, we're not going to drop you off anywhere. Like, we kind of need you guys to do something for us. And we gave you this free ride. And as soon as they really started putting up like resistance to this, what do you think was the first thing that these men requested from our two partners that are with them? Their ID, it's a good guess. What's their communication device? Cell phones, yeah. So give us your cell phones. Like, you don't need to tell anybody about this. And it wasn't, the way she describes it, it wasn't super violent up front. She kind of thought like, okay, we're in trouble, but maybe if we like sort of cooperate, we could get out of trouble because they're not, you know, harming us. And then they did. She didn't really talk about the next segment of what happened much. She did insinuate that there was violence used at one point, and that kind of taught her a lesson that you don't, you know, resist. And then from there began a couple of years of her being trafficked, typically by one pimp. She said that there was a small period of time where she was traded to a gang in Pittsburgh and she was trafficked through a gang. The gang was the only group of traffickers that ever introduced substances. Everyone else wanted her to be substance free. She was traded a few times, but the longest length of time she spent while being trafficked was with this pimp who she was with when she escaped. So this had been, you know, a couple of years of being trafficked by the time she gets to us. It was primarily sex trafficking. It was primarily on the East Coast. It was like a traveling sex trafficking venture, which is not necessarily what we often see in West Virginia. There's parts of this story that are like so typical West Virginia, and then there's parts of it that are not average. We don't see a lot of multiple victim trafficking by one pimp. I mean, it certainly happens, but we're seeing more like smaller scale operations, more common, at least the clients that are making it to us. But hers was definitely larger scale. She did lose track of that woman that she had met on the train at some point, and to this day no one knows where that person is. She didn't even remember her real name at that point because they went by different names. She never got her last name. So it was just, you know, that was a very hard subject for her to talk about. So the reason she didn't want to involve law enforcement, she had actually been arrested for prostitution twice through this time. The first time she was arrested, she said it was like 2 months after, like she had not been involved very long and was arrested. And the first thing she said when she got to the police station was, so listen, this guy picked me up at a bus station, like didn't really want to do this, just trying to live, like trying to make it through. He hurt us. And the police officer at the time said, that's what they all say. So she was like, well, not going to get any help here. And she kind of just gave up on law enforcement at that point. So we know that that was like 2012. We know that things have changed since then. She was arrested a second time a couple of years later and did not disclose. And what do you think happened both times? Who do you think bailed her out? Do you think that the person who bailed her out brought her back for her court date? No. So she had 2 warrants from missing court dates in Pennsylvania. So we were like, okay, that makes complete sense. Like, we're not gonna, she was adamant about not reporting. Just really had no faith at that point that she would be believing. So we came up with this genius plan. Don't do this. It's not a good plan. We were like, wait a minute, you have like your mom in Florida, right? Like, so she had maintained sort of communication with her family throughout this, like intermittently. Her family believed, now the story that they were given from her was that she met this great guy in Northern Virginia and she just decided to stay up here with him. And, it was kind of like she was living a new life and she wasn't really communicating with her family at home, but they didn't have any reason to believe that she was in danger. So we were like, wait, you have like, mom and a daughter in Florida. Like, this is a great idea. Because oftentimes when individuals come into the shelter, they truly have no supportive family. So it was like, oh man, like, okay. So we were like, well, how about we reunify you with your family? And she was like, great idea. Like, I'd love to go home. Okay. So we bought her a bus ticket. We did. She didn't want to take the airplane. I was like, do not talk to anyone on that bus. No, I'm kidding. But I was like, do not take and don't get in any other cars. Like, we have somebody set to pick you up in Florida. So we sent her back home and we thought we did a good thing. And here's where we realized that we did a horrible job. When the hotline had initially set it all up and we got her, they called us like as soon as she was settled. And I talked to the same hotline worker. I swear we were like best friends. We had talked all day. And, they were celebrating. She made it. This is great. And then they said, do you need like resources? Like, do you guys need help providing services to her? And I was like, no, oh my gosh, like this is what we do. We do this every day. And they were like, yeah, but trafficking's different. And I was like, no, it's basically sexual assault. Yeah, I said that. We're fine. We don't need any help. And they were like, okay, well, if you change your mind, like, just let us know. Okay. We sent her to Florida. Her mom calls like 2 weeks later and says, she's gone. No one knows where she is. This is not my daughter. Who did you send me? You sent me someone that's not my daughter. She cusses now. She smokes now. She has tattoos. This is not my daughter. And that was the first time that I was like, we probably really sent this traumatized human being back to her Southern Baptist family who does not understand the trauma that she went through and the change that has occurred within this person might have just set her up for some failure there. So had a hard time getting a hold of her, eventually did. And she eventually told me that she had moved to Tampa and was working out of a brothel. She was working in sex work. And when I kind of, talked to her about it, she said, well, I witnessed how much money people can make off of this. So if I'm my own boss, like I'm clearly good at it. This is, what I've been doing for years and I can't get another job. Like, how am I going to explain this gap in my resume? So I'm just going to do it. And hung up the phone with her, called Polaris and apologized and told them I was wrong and I need all the help that they can give me. So I kind of explained what was happening. They sent me a lot of resources. We were able to get her to contact a local program in Tampa, and they were able to help her for a while. She did stay in the sex work industry for a while, but then eventually did leave and was able to secure like an apartment and a different job and was doing okay, but definitely would have been doing better had we not, sent her back with no resources to this family that has no idea what they're getting into. So we learned a lot of lessons from that case, a lot of lessons from the fact that it might not necessarily be the criminal justice system that can always help, to the idea that family reunification is a whole service by itself that has to be respected and done with tact. And so from there, we talked with Polaris for a long time, and we basically begged them to help us. We said, you know, obviously this is a problem in West Virginia. Obviously it's happening here. You know, like there has to be something that's done about it. There has to be somewhere that knows what it's doing, that these survivors can access services from. So from about 2012 to 2014, 15, we focused on learning everything that we could. There wasn't much information out there at the time. There is significantly more now, which is interesting because it's only, 5-6 years ago, but it's just so much more broad information now. And we were really trying at the time. Polaris, we got lucky. One of their employees lives in Shepherdstown, and she was home on maternity leave and volunteered to come in and train our staff with her baby. It was a wild ride. So she came and she taught us, and she helped us every step of the way. She actually works internationally for Polaris. She doesn't even work with American citizens, but, obviously she brought in her colleagues, and it was just very helpful. And then about that time, and I don't remember, I think it was 2015, the task force started at a state level. As Andy said, he was a co-founder, and we joined pretty immediately. And then it was like nice because there were other people to talk to about these things we were learning. And then in 2015, we officially changed our mission statement to include trafficking survivors as a victimization that we serve. And we have kind of just never stopped talking about it and never stopped trying to work to develop an approach in the state, in our counties. We wanted every DV program and every sexual assault program to be able to serve these survivors and not make the mistakes that we made in the beginning. So from now, flash forward 6 years, we serve anywhere from 100 to 150 survivors of trafficking every year. Sometimes they have multiple victimizations, meaning they're also domestic violence victims, also sexual assault victims. Sometimes it's just trafficking. Most of the survivors we see are sex trafficking survivors, but we've definitely served labor trafficking survivors before. So I'm going to get back in to the, I have two of them open, to the root of the, okay, we're back. Okay. I feel like Andy covered this a little bit, so we're going to go through it, but we're going to talk about, so keeping in mind that situation that we just discussed, you'll see, you'll be able to pick up on the red flags kind of as we go through them. But then, of course, there's thousands and millions and trillions of other situations. Every situation is different. Every situation, the survivor, comes to the situation with different lived experiences. So we're just going to talk about potential red flags, something to keep your ears open for. So these are the ones that you want to kind of be listening for, putting them in the context of what's happening, because obviously, just having a risk factor. So being someone who has substance use disorder doesn't necessarily mean that you're being trafficked. What it does mean is that you're more vulnerable to trafficking. So we're looking at it, kind of in that lens. So restricted freedom of movement. They talk about how, well, I wish I could, go out whenever I wanted to, but I'm never allowed to do that. Or they might talk about really high security measures that exist at work, or where they make their money, or something like that. They might have a very explicit online profile. You may not know that, but they could mention it, or they could mention seeing someone else's. Mentioning large amount of debt in general, but specifically to their employer. And has none of their own personal possessions, doesn't have their ID, maybe doesn't have their own cell phone, they share a cell phone, doesn't have access to their birth certificate, social security card, which we know, again, is not necessarily indicative, but it's definitely something to kind of get your mind moving. Could have unusual tattoos. As we mentioned, this specific survivor left Florida with no tattoos, came home with tattoos. I don't remember what the tattoos were. I don't know if there was a name. The only time that I remember them being mentioned is when the mom was like, my kid didn't have tattoos and now she does. Has a large amount of cash or a large amount of credit cards on their possession. has multiple cell phones. Particularly, we're looking at like teenagers, because oftentimes a method of grooming is to provide like the newest of the new thing. So they might have like an iPhone 7 that their parents bought them, but then they also have this iPhone 12, which I'm horrible with electronics. The only reason I know that an iPhone 12 is the newest one is because my birthday's next month, and that's what my boyfriend's buying me, and he thinks it's great, and I have no idea that it's like fancy, but he was like, it's a 12. So that's the newest one, if you're wondering. Has evidence of travel, lots of hotel key cards. I always laugh at this one too, because I'm notorious for forgetting to turn my key card in. So if you like looked in my work bag, there's a lot of them in there. So like we said, not always an indicator, but definitely something to kind of perk your ears up. Lies about their age or identity, or doesn't really know it, which before this sounded insane to me before. Doesn't really know it. Like, you would know your own age. Okay, nope. Exhibit A. We had a survivor come to us who had been adopted into the US as a child, like pre-memory child. She was like 4 or 5 when she was adopted. Her adoptive family was trafficking her. And by this point, she's 20-ish. She doesn't know. They gave her a brand new identity. So they gave her a different name. They gave her a different birthday, or at least she thinks it's a different birthday. They made her 2 years younger, or they told her they made her 2 years younger. So she truly didn't know her real identity. She didn't know who she was before she was adopted here. She didn't know her biological given name, and she didn't know her actual birth date. So that was really hard, because we were like, where do we even start? Like, how do we get legal documents for this person who knows nothing? So that took some interaction. She did not want to report either. She had her own reasons. Her trafficker is and was and still is a pretty influential person in the community. Everyone knows them. So I didn't, but I don't know anyone, but most people know them. So she really didn't want to report because of that. She was afraid, that they wouldn't believe her. But we actually were able to work with an FBI agent locally, Ellen Duffy, if anyone knows her, she's fantastic, to just get some information on like, how do we start to even find this information? And that was really helpful, but we were kind of just like, I don't even know how to start. Will not want to talk about themselves or tell you anything about how they got where they are or their past. Resistant to help. We're going to talk about danger avoidance tactics. Resisting help is one of them. If you don't accept help, no one can hurt you. If all you've ever been is hurt, you'll do anything to avoid it. Using slang terms you've may have never even heard of, to talk about all things related to trafficking. Okay. Victim response. This is sort of our specialty. Some things to note about trafficking that I think are often either misconceptions or just like kind of like not generally known. It does not require transportation. So that's not something you need to listen for. The survivor doesn't have to be transported anywhere. Many of the survivors we work with are born in West Virginia, trafficked in West Virginia. They never leave. They're trafficked to mom and dad's friends. They're trafficked to somebody the landlord knows. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be this whole criminal enterprise. It can happen in smaller pockets where there's no transportation involved. It's different than human smuggling. Main differences. Trafficking is exploitation based. Smuggling is transportation based. If the person who is being smuggled is not cooperating, then they're not being smuggled. The person who's being smuggled is cooperating. It's like a business venture, kind of like a business agreement. If the person being smuggled is not cooperating, they need help. They've been kidnapped, they're being trafficked. Regardless, they should be like, they have to give consent to be smuggled. If they didn't, something's wrong. So when you hear the language that we've heard passed around, like they're being smuggled over the border to come and, commit crimes, or they're smuggled over the border, kicking and screaming against their will, then they're not being smuggled and they need help, right? Trafficking is against someone's will. Smuggling, it's a contract, they agree to it, it's a business relationship, and the relationship ends once the person being smuggled reaches their destination and once the funds are paid. Physical force or bondage is not always required. It's rare. There's different types of trafficking where it's more common, which we'll talk about, but it's definitely not in every case. It can occur within a legitimate business. Initial consent or voluntary migration is irrelevant. So if, let's say, someone was smuggled from, I don't know, like Russia, to the US, and it was like $800 up front. I know nothing, so it's probably more than that. So let's say it's like $800, cool, here we go. Well, it takes longer than they think. The plane ride's more expensive, whatever. They get here and the smuggler says, so it's actually $3,000. And the person being smuggled is like, no, I have 800. Like, I can't do that. They say, it's fine. You can work it off in my brothel. It just became human trafficking. And the fact that they voluntarily came to the country is irrelevant. They're still a victim of human trafficking. That's what the T visa is all about, which is a visa for victims of trafficking to become citizens. It is basically forced labor, involuntary servitude, and modern day slavery. So it's important to know that in your position, you know, on the QRT, you could potentially be the first person that someone discloses to about what's happening to them. So even though you're not necessarily providing them services for the victimization of human trafficking, you still have to be able to work through it with them, because you don't want to just be like, oh, thanks, bye, I'm going to call these other people, right? Like, you have to be able to have a conversation to pass them off to the people who can really help. So using trauma-informed care when you're talking with a survivor, asking what happened to them, understanding rather than what they did to get here, understand that their past trauma could be triggered by their current experiences. So something that happened to them as a child could be resurfacing in this current victimization. We want to emphasize physical, psychological, and emotional safety for them and for you. Hearing these things on a daily basis is not easy. Trust me, hearing them once is not easy. I almost argue sometimes that it's easier for it to be your job. It's easier for us because we're prepared for it. We're used to it. We have, you know, self-care, we have reflection, we can talk to our supervisors, like, we are set. But for someone who doesn't necessarily work in the victimization field, to hear these disclosures can be very traumatizing. So make sure that you have a plan for yourself if something like that happens. And you're talking to them in a strengths-based framework. So how did you survive? And discuss that no matter what they did to survive, it kept them alive up to this point, and acknowledge how brave that was. So survivors of human trafficking are often survivors of lifetime trauma. I have still to this day never worked with a survivor of human trafficking that wasn't also a survivor of something else in their lifetime, whether that's child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, ongoing neglect. They were a survivor of something else. So longtime trauma survivors often use some pretty serious danger avoidance tactics, which means they might present in a way that makes it hard to serve them. They might present in the fight mode, which is hyperarousal. They're aggressive, irritable, angry. They might commit self-harm. These are the people who you walk in, you know, like to our shelter, for example, walk in, it's Monday morning, you're like, good morning. And they're like, there's nothing good about today. And it's like 8 a.m. How bad could it be yet, right? But that kind of, like, they present just aggressive and irritable about very simple tasks. And the purpose of fight mode is to prevent them from becoming either attached or believing in another person, believing that the work that you're doing is going to help them, believing that the shelter is going to help them, because if they believe it, they can be let down. And if they don't believe it, they can't be let down. Flee. These are the ones that avoid other people. They'll avoid any traumatic trigger, anything. So they might avoid having a discussion they need to have. Let's say that you gave them like a case management assignment, or you're a medical professional and they're trying to get treatment and you need to talk to them about, you know, past medical issues. They'll walk out of the appointment rather than telling you past medical issues, because they don't want to talk about it. It's too traumatic, and they'd rather completely avoid the trigger than deal with what emotion the trigger causes, because dealing with it has never worked before. Freeze. They feel stuck. They're anxious. They operate in a constant state of panic. These are the people who, you know, they finally get their job interview and they're so excited. And the only way to get to the job interview is to take the bus, but they've never ridden the bus, and the unknowns of the bus are just too much. So they don't go. And then you, as their case manager, you're like, hey, remember how you wanted that job interview for like a year and you got it and you didn't go? And they'd be like, yeah, I didn't go, whatever. They didn't go because they were afraid to ride the bus, but they're not going to tell you that, because if they tell you that, it's showing a vulnerability. And then the last one are the people who shut down. They're submit. They're numb, no emotional expression. They'll tune you out. They have no interest in pursuing their goals, whatever those are, whatever program you're in, and just happy to kind of float through life. And these are the ones that you're like, how do they not care? Their whole life is spiraling down around them. It's not that they don't care. It's that the last time they cared, it didn't help at all. The last 75 times they cared, it didn't help at all. So trying something different, right? To avoid danger. So try to keep these tactics in mind when you're working with survivors, because it's just so common and they truly can't help it. Like their body does this, their brain does this. If you ever have to do a safety plan, even if you're doing a brief one, like before you put them in contact with services, you're looking to prevent the crisis. What are you going to do if the crisis occurs? What are the risks of the trafficker in the community? And what are the risks of life? So what if they don't get that job they applied for? Then how are they going to pay their rent? Like we're talking about that kind of stuff. You want to be aware of the trafficker's presence in the community. If you're working with them, if they are using an interpreter, you want to make sure you're using like a service, not like someone that you know from town, because you don't know who might know this person. You will often, if you have someone disclose to you, they will rarely say, I'm a victim of human trafficking. Instead, they'll describe what's happening and you'll identify them as a victim of human trafficking. Know the legal limits and what benefits are available to survivors, which is a whole nother training. But if you're interested in, if you start following like the task force and what it's doing, those are the sort of more in-depth trainings that we offer, you know, periodically. They might have limited English proficiency. They might have limited knowledge of how to access community resources. So you can't just say, I heard about Epic in Martinsburg, here's their number, call them. Like that could work. But what could be more effective is doing a warm handoff and calling with them. Be like, oh, let me call them up right now and see who I can get on the phone with you. Or let me reach out to them and have them call you. Or like, because calling Epic might just be like completely foreign to them. They have no idea what you're talking about. Might not know much about daily living skills. We've had survivors that have no idea how to wash a load of laundry. So walking through those things and understanding that might be a factor. Black, they may not be familiar with the area, may have never taken public transportation. They might be fearful of law enforcement or of reporting. The worst thing you can do is pressure them to report. You can give them all their options, which that would be what we would do. We could walk you through giving them all their options, but you want to lose someone very fast, you will force them to report. Sometimes they will, sometimes they'll come around after time. You have to build rapport. Sometimes they won't, and that's up to them. We'll talk about the difference between child and adult victims. It's up to them if they're an adult, not if they're a child. You are probably a mandated reporter. All right, we're gonna do it. We have time. All right, this is my favorite activity. Andy's only seen this 300,000 times, so I'm sorry. So on Zoom, this is a very interesting activity to do. But for anyone who is actively like at your computer, on your phone, and you have the ability to turn your camera on, turn it on now if you don't mind. We don't care if you're in your pajamas. I am in my pajamas on the bottom, so we're together. All right, look at you all showing up. Okay, if you cannot turn your camera on, I'm going to show you a Zoom trick. At the bottom right of your Zoom screen, right next to the leave button, is a button that says reactions. If you click on it, there's an option to raise your hand, and it looks like that. See my hands raised? Okay, so here's what you're going to do. If, and you have to lower your hand, by the way. So if you cannot turn your camera on, or if you feel more comfortable using that reaction, that's what you're going to do. So everyone either give us a thumbs up in your camera or give us your hand raised thing. And Andy, we'll see. The thumb might go away on its own. I don't know, but we'll try it. If your thumb goes away, it went away. If your thumb goes away, raise your hand because it won't go away until you tell it to. Okay, so what you're going to do with your thumbs up is I'm going to give you a scenario. If you think you personally yourself would respond to that scenario with logic, meaning you take a deep breath, you think through your options, and then you react, you're going to keep your hand up or keep your thumb raised. If you think you yourself that you would react with impulse. Now, impulse doesn't mean that you start throwing punches. It just means that you react initially, whatever your initial reaction is. If your initial reaction is to cuss someone out, you cuss someone out. If your initial reaction is to throw a punch, you're going to throw a punch, like obviously not in real life. But if you think you would respond with impulse, you're going to put your hand down, put your thumb down, you're going to keep it down. So we'll start out. You'll get it once we get going. So here's your scenario to start. Remember, you are all still going right now. You are at an airport and you're traveling for a personal reason. It's not for work, and you're traveling by yourself. Okay, some people are already out of it. They're like, I'm not going. So you're all still there. Good job. So you're at the airport, you're traveling by yourself, whatever. You checked your bag. You are going to, and on the other end of the flight, there is someone waiting for you. Like, you're getting picked up at the airport. So you are, at the airport, you're going to your, oh my God, I haven't flown in so long. What are they called? Your boarding place. What are they? Does anyone remember what they're called?
Terminal.
Your
Terminal.
gate.
Your
Oh,
gate.
Yeah, your gate.
yeah, we all need to go on an airplane. Oh my gosh. Well, first up for me, 2021, go on an airplane again. Okay, so we're getting to our terminal, to our gate. And you get there and you're waiting to board your flight, and you go to board and they say, oh, sorry, you've been bumped from the flight. Is everyone still okay? Did anyone go out? Okay, the other thing you could do if you're out is you can turn your camera off. Whatever is easier. You're all still okay. All right, we're all okay. Everyone's like, it's fine, I can be bumped. So you're bumped. You're like, whatever, I'll wait, cool. So you're waiting for a while for them to get back to you, and they tell you that, okay, I can get you on another flight in 12 hours. So now at this point, you're stuck overnight in the airport. How we doing? Okay, some people are out. All right, it's all right. It's okay if you're out, we're fine. Okay. Some people are cussing already. So you're 12 hours. They won't give you a hotel room. So you just sleep in the little airport chair, whatever. It's annoying, but you're okay. Next day, morning, 6 a.m. You go to get on your flight and you're bumped again. How we doing now? How you feel? Mark just turned his camera off. He was like, I'm over it. All right. Okay. Some of you are still standing. We're doing all right. Andy's out. Andy's cussing. Okay, so you're like, what? So you're now arguing with the, if you're still here, you're arguing logically with the, flight people. See, I already don't remember their stuff. It's been too long. And they're like, okay, fine, whatever. We can get you on a flight like in 6 hours. So you're stuck waiting 6 more hours. How are we feeling? We're a little angry, but we're okay. We're still, logical.
I actually like airports, so it doesn't bother me.
Whew, I mean, I would like to see one now since I don't even remember what they look like, but I would not like it if this was happening. So, by the way, I would have been out. I would have been out a long time ago. I don't even know when I would have lost it, but I would have lost it. So I would probably just be crying in a corner and they would be like, what? So you get it. You get on your airplane. You're like, whoa, okay, 18 hours later, I'm on my airplane. You get to the destination, you get off your airplane and you go to baggage claim, and guess what isn't there?
Your bag.
Your bag is gone. Your bag is missing. How are we feeling now?
Like you've heard my stories.
Uh-huh.
That's what I was thinking.
Okay, so bag's missing. Some of you are still hanging in there. You're doing okay. It's really fun when you do this in person because you have everyone stand up and they sit down as they go out. So like by the end, there's like one person left standing and no one believes them. So bag missing. You're like, okay, whatever. So you go to the bag people, told you I can't remember anybody's name, and you're begging them to find your bag. You're like, I'm not leaving this airport until you find it. So they, whatever, it takes like 3 hours. They finally locate your bag and they bring it to you and it's damaged and there are some items missing. How are we feeling? Anyone feel their blood pressure rising? Just hearing the story. Okay, so then the logical some of you that are left that we're not really sure if we believe you, you go, this is your last step. You go up to the baggage people and you're like, dude, my bag is broken and my stuff's missing. Like, what are you going to do about this? And the baggage people slide the little door shut in your face. Stacy just lost it. I saw you. You just lost it. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the end of the activity is here. Good job. Tell me how you're feeling. Whether you were the first one out or you're still standing, tell me how you're feeling.
I guess confused, like, well, why did he slam the thing on the face for?
Right. Why would they do that? And then every single time, almost every single time I've ever done this training, someone has tried to argue with me that that wouldn't happen. They wouldn't shut the door in your face. I'm like, okay, but they did. But they wouldn't. I'm like, okay, but they did. And the point of it is for you to accept the fact that a system that is supposed to help you did not help you. And there is no like reason or rhyme as to why. So that's the feeling you're describing right now. You said confused and super frustrated. Yep. What else?
I would say a little bit of hopelessness.
Uh-huh.
A little bit, not like, when typically social workers and therapists think hopelessness is the end of the world, but
right.
Yeah.
Right. You're just like this day, like you're not hopeless with your whole life. You're hopeless with this whole trip, right? Somebody said disbelief. Like, how could this happen? How did this all happen to one person in 24 hours?
From practical experience, go ahead. I would say from practical experience, this is why I always fly carry-on. This type of thing happening on an international travel where I ended up arriving a day late, visiting one state and 2 countries that I'd never intended to visit. Yeah.
So you have previous experience. So you're like, yeah, I mean, dude, I navigated this before. Like, I don't have to cuss anyone out. I'll make it.
Well, I mean, I wanted to cuss people out, but it does no good. There's trying to either trying to work within or around the system so that you sit down and cuss it out, but you then have to try and figure out how to make it work so you can survive.
Of course, I reminded Steve Martin had it worse on Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Have you seen that movie?
Right. So then you start thinking, well, people might have had it worse than me, right? But I'm still real mad. So what I want you to think about with that feeling is so oftentimes victims of extreme trauma react to everything with impulse, and they do it because that limit that you're feeling, that disbelief, that confusion, I can't believe this happened, that has happened like 500 times over the course of their life. So it's only impulse at that point. Logic has never worked. So why use it? Okay, so we're going to cover the model process and then we're going to take questions, I think. This, which we could give you in a document if you need it, but this is literally the document, so you're welcome to just screenshot it. The Human Trafficking Task Force, one of their focuses was we need to make sure that there's a basic, easy model for people to follow if they identify a victim of human trafficking. Where do they send them? And what do we do? So, adult. Adults can be, if the victim wants to report to law enforcement, and if you don't know of a law enforcement body that you could safely disclose to, call the Fusion Center. They will know who to send the victim to. And I would give you more detail, but it truly depends on the community. Like for me, I can usually decide if I think it's federal or state. And if I think it has a federal nexus, I usually just call the U.S. Attorney's Office directly. I don't even call the Fusion Center because I know I can tell the nexus, but a lot of people can't. They're not sure. It's super convoluted. We don't know. Call the Fusion Center. The point person, now, if they don't want to report, or they're not sure, or you're not really sure what's going on, you can send them to your local rape crisis center. Rape crisis centers cover almost all 55 states. It's pretty much all at this point. There's just some up and coming ones still. But I'm going to show you the website to where you can find which one is in your area. And that is for sex trafficking victims. If they are a labor trafficking survivor, they'll go to the W.Va program. I'll also provide you the website to where you can see who serves your area. But truly, if you mix it up, if you call the wrong one, they can refer back and forth. So don't worry about necessarily always getting it right. For a minor, you would have to make a mandatory report. It is not the survivor's choice at that point whether they want it to be reported. They are a minor, so it is a mandatory report. That mandatory report, you also have to call West Virginia State Police, and then DHHR and the state police will then work with law enforcement. They might pass them off to a forensic interview. I mean, it kind of just all goes from there, but that's your entry points into how to get services. DV Rape Crisis Service or CPS law enforcement for minors. Look, there we go. So the West Virginia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, that's their website. That lists all of the programs in which counties they serve. And then FRIS, the Foundation for Rape Information and Services, is the sexual assault programs. And that lists all of the counties that they serve. So I encourage you to just check out those websites and see who serves your area. And then we just included a couple other resources for you, and especially the Human Trafficking Task Force in West Virginia. That's where you could follow potential trainings. And then that is our contact info. So now in our 4 minutes, we could take questions if you're ready. Andy, does that work? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, let's roll.
For anybody who wanted that contact information, because that went by really quickly, I will happily share it with all of you. Just shoot me an email and I will make sure that you get it.
Yeah, I'll put my email in the chat too.
Hi, Lee Smith here, Mon County. I'm going to have to jump off here because I live my life on Zoom and I need to get on yet another call. But I wanted to express my sincere thanks that Katie and Andrew put on. This is a difficult topic. Your all's enthusiasm and passion for this certainly shine through. I've heard some of it before, but I learned something each time. And I think that we brought this to partners through the substance abuse sort of lens, if you will. But, you know, that thing that you said earlier about the elements that bring people to be victimized, the substance abuse, the poverty, the insecure housing, and the foster care. I mean, that is a lot of Appalachia. And I really appreciate your all's insights into this crime that is ever present, but difficult to identify, hiding in plain sight there. And so I appreciate you all bringing this out. And again, for everyone's time to hear. I hope that there are other questions. I just wanted to make that comment before I jump off. So Andrew, Katie, again, and Stacy, thank you for your help in putting all this together. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, Lee. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm an instructor of political science for Eastern West Virginia Community Technical College in Moorfield, West Virginia, in Hardy County, and as part of my classes, I talk about human trafficking, trying to make students aware of it, and I mentioned that it's not just something that happens in the big cities. It could happen here. This is called the Potomac Highlands. It could happen here in Potomac Highlands, West Virginia. And I've heard about it going on here, but I came here from Harrisonburg, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. And in Harrisonburg, Virginia, there was a Peruvian restaurant where I think where you had victims of labor trafficking in a Peruvian restaurant. And somebody knew about signs of human trafficking somehow. And they ended up calling the hotline to rescue the victims. And so therefore, that encourages me to talk about it because that person knew about it somehow. If the person didn't know about it, it wouldn't have been empowered. So how can I tell, what would be things to tell students to tell them about being aware about possible signs of trafficking going on, like even here in the Potomac Highlands of West Virginia?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for your interest and for your passion to share information with your students. I mean, I think for me, you're doing the right thing. I don't know. I think there's a lot of resources online. I'm sure you've seen to share information about trafficking. Polaris Project's really where I would start. There are actually some good resources there about rural trafficking. And I think to me, when it comes to students nowadays, from research I've done, you know, like psychological, sociological things I've read, it's really the power is in the story that you share. I can, you know, in this crowd, especially given the professions that are represented on the call, I can talk about statistics and I can talk about, you know, bullet points and facts. And for some of you, it might get boring over time, but you can synthesize the information pretty effectively and you follow where I'm going with it. I think in this generation, which is completely acculturated with television and very you know, small packets of information through internet, different internet sources, I think it's really important to communicate things through stories. And by that, in this context, I would suggest, you know, finding stories of actual trafficking in rural locations and saying, this has happened in this place. Why couldn't it happen here? And, you know, Katie has stories. I have stories I've read about. We, unfortunately, in West Virginia, we're not prosecuting these cases nearly like we'd want to, because in part because victims are so reluctant to come forward, which is another thing to explore another time. But all that is to say, I think that you're probably in tune with a lot of information out there, probably the most effective way to communicate is through stories of actual cases.
Yeah, I guess like when I mentioned about it going on in Harrisonburg, even though it's in another state, it's close by here, and so they identify that.
Yep.
So I want to ask our QRT members, Mon County QRT, Marion County, Berkeley County. I'm going to call some of you out, and I know we had Charleston's QRT on here as well. As a QRT, one, do you feel like this was helpful in some of the interactions that you may be having in the community? And two, if yes or no, what do you feel we could include in the future in a training like this to make it most effective?
Well, I feel that you guys did a wonderful job, and I think it demonstrates that it very well may be that substance use would not be the primary, and it sounds maybe a little odd, but substance use would not be the primary reason they began using substance. Maybe they were forced to. So having an addiction based on being forced to is something I never would think about before this training. So I think that's a great point to demonstrate just how we do not know where someone has come from in order to be where they are right now.
And hey, Stacy, this is Becky. I think that it's good to hear because we're very closely related teams. And maybe when we're looking at, you know, some of the situations that we are encounter with the patient, we're thinking, or not the patient, sorry, being a nurse. When we encounter, like maybe Stephen is more out, you know, what am I trying to say? We are thinking, we are expanding our support view on the patients when we see them. Instead of thinking, oh, we got to get you clean, we got to get you food, we're thinking, hey, maybe there's another aspect to this. So I thought it was very, very helpful.
You kind of talked earlier in the conversation about many individuals that are part of human trafficking can't self-identify. They're not going to use that language. So what type of questions would you think would be staple, standardized questions that you would want to engage this population with to increase identification?
We actually have, Andy, I don't know if you have any, we have some in our intake, I'm trying to find it, that, all right, here it is, that are without directly asking, you're basically screening. So some of them could be, if they have identified as someone who traveled to the US, they're not a citizen, you could ask if anyone arranged their travel for them to the US. Have you ever worked or done any other activity in which you thought you'd be paid, but you weren't? Did anyone where you've worked ever make you feel unsafe or scared? Has anyone ever taken or kept your identity from you? Has anyone ever taken a photo or video of you that you weren't uncomfortable with? Did anyone ever pressure you to touch someone or have any other unwanted contact with someone else? Has anyone ever pressured you to have sex for things of value? Describe to me what you're most concerned about right now. It's kind of an open-ended one. You might get lots of answers, but those can kind of help bring out and I could send those to Stacy if you want to send them out to the group. I'm happy to send them to you.
I can chime in on that too. I wouldn't necessarily suggest a specific set of questions per se. And there's really good models that Katie has, and the Vera Institute has a screening model as well that I'd recommend looking at, and you can kind of draw from multiple sources and kind of come up with some screening tools and questions. But I think one piece of advice I would give for those folks who might, when you encounter a potential victim, is to not ask why questions, because why questions connote judgment to a victim. Oftentimes they perceive that as you judging their conduct. You have to play the role when you're asking questions of and kind of interviewing, so to speak, a victim and trying to discern if there's potential trafficking. You have to play the role of a journalist and ask what and how questions, and ideally, in my mind at least, go it from a very deliberate, piece by piece route, and with very short questions, asking very simple things, and trying to touch on, using that methodology, trying to touch on the core elements and vulnerabilities that we covered. So it's going to vary per circumstance. But if you think, for example, that a victim has a drug problem, you explore, okay, so do you use drugs? How often do you use drugs? What kind of drugs do you use? When did you start using drugs? When you got drugs, how did you get them? And did you have to pay for them? Was there anything that you had to do in order to get the drugs besides like paying money for them? And kind of go about that right as a kind of from a curious approach, a curious tone of a well-meaning journalist, really, is the way I would look at it. And I'm sure folks would differ about that in terms of approaches, but that would be my suggestion, because you don't want to convey judgment, and one, two, you have to be very simple, because there's this trauma informed aspect of it as well, that they are going to have a hard time processing lengthy, complicated ideas and questions. So you're going to have to be very simple in the question process in order to derive very simple information that you yourself have to put together and stack up, and to get a better idea what's really happening.
And Katie, do you find, I mean, if you're trafficked and you become a drug addict, or you get a substance abuse problem, or you have a substance abuse problem, and then you think you're trafficking yourself to support your habit. I mean, I see that being an emotional, like, oh no, I'm really doing this myself. I'm in control, but I need my drug, so I'm going to go do this to get my drug, not even realizing that they're the trafficked person.
Yeah, I mean, it would be where that could relate to human trafficking would be if someone else, if there was a like party involved in, okay, you go, turn these 3 tricks and I'll give you the substance that you want for the next 3 weeks. Something like that. And yeah, it certainly happens where the survivor might not even know that what is happening to them is wrong, or they might think that they deserve it because they are using the substance that this person's giving them. But there's been a Supreme Court case that determined that using someone's substance use disorder as a way to control them and to manipulate them into human trafficking is considered coercion. So by law, it would be considered coercion. And then in practice, it's, obviously coercion. You're exploiting someone's, medical need.
Yeah, just to put a little bit of more nuance to that, is that that being said, that while that can constitute trafficking, in some situations it may not constitute trafficking. It can be completely transactional, where an adult says to another adult, hey, if you sleep with me, or if you sleep with somebody else, then you'll get drugs. I'll give you drugs. That's is kind of a elevated form, so to speak, or a different form of prostitution. The real question then becomes, at what point does the prospect of getting drugs for someone who's an addict At what point are they selling themselves for commercial sex, when they wouldn't otherwise?
Right.
When again, either against their will, explicitly, or they are compelled. That compulsion always gets, for adults, always comes back down to the compulsion. So there could be scenarios where there's an exchange of drugs for sex or commercial sex, where there's not genuine compulsion, but that line gets blurry when we're dealing with drugs. And so that's just something to bear in mind. It's definitely a red flag and something to keep note of and something to document if you're interacting with victims and see that. But it's important to ask those follow-up questions. Is, what would you have done if you didn't get the drugs, or would you have, or vice versa, would you have prostituted yourself if it wasn't for the drugs? And those kinds of questions become really important when we're talking about coercion
right. And Katie did a good job, because I was thinking, if I approach someone and I don't even know if they would understand when they cross that line. I don't know if they would think I'm being trafficked, or this is all my fault. And it's just interesting concept. I don't have the answers, but it made me think more about how to deal with that. Or why wouldn't someone, they're either way. Okay. Thank you.
A lot of times there is a normalization. So someone doesn't necessarily realize that they have been trafficked. In those situations where I've seen substance use come into play, where it becomes trafficking, is an individual being traded without their knowledge, or their and then forced into, so trafficked for someone else's drugs. And when drugs are being used, but they are having to pay for everyone else's drugs through force or coercion.
Yeah, I think I've kind of mentioned before, to my, when we talk about the issue in the classes, I guess even the I guess the voluntary prostitution, sometimes it seems like there can be a thin line between what's voluntary and what's coercion and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we all have to sincerely ask ourselves how many women or men aspire to be prostitutes. I mean, that's not a you don't learn about that as a career goal in elementary school. And so there's a brokenness that leads down that path, almost invariably. For some, there are exceptions. There are some sex workers who kind of look at it as a way to make extra money. There's stories about that among the crowd that want to legalize sex work, a crowd that I will adamantly do not count myself in. But so there are exceptions, to be sure. But on the whole, I think there's a brokenness that leads folks down that path, and it could be any number of things, not necessarily coercion, but in any event, there's oftentimes, in fact, I have a slide in my typical presentation that kind of talks about rethinking prostitution, and it talks about this interesting study that was done, I believe, in Europe, with a large sample of prostitutes in multiple countries, and reflected how frequently, how most of them did not want to be prostitutes, how most of them had been sexually assaulted, how most of them had, or a significant portion of them had struggled with drug abuse, and on and on and on and on. And you just see just all these indicia of trafficking. You see the I'll call it the evil of that occupation, really, and the impact that it has on these women predominantly. And yeah, it's very sobering to look at that.
And I'd go a little further in saying, and Katie, you tell me, because I'm not a therapist, but in my prior work, many times, especially when this starts, when they're juveniles, from a young age on, which is a lot of what we see here in West Virginia, they definitely don't identify as victims. They don't realize that that's not how everybody else grows up, that you don't do that in your house. And so many times they don't know that it's wrong. So they wouldn't report it, and they wouldn't tell you and disclose in a way that lets you know that they're a victim. Am I wrong in that they just don't recognize it?
Yeah, no, they truly may not, or they may know that what's happening is wrong, but they don't know that it's human trafficking, or they think that they take some sort of responsibility for it because of a decision they made or something they did, or so it's definitely very convoluted. Oftentimes, like with us, it takes us kind of saying, like, the situation you're describing is human trafficking, like that's what's happening or had happened to you, and then it takes them some time to work through that, because a lot of people, the general public, see human trafficking as like the movie Taken, or it has to happen internationally, or it has to be, gang trafficking, or it has to be pimp larger scale trafficking. It can't just be one-on-one. So I think like working through all the kind of just learning the red flags yourself and identifying it, and then knowing where to send someone to get help is like the greatest thing you could do.
All right. Does anybody else have any other questions? I know we went over the 2 hours. Does anybody else have any other questions before we end the call?
I know I already asked a couple questions, but I just wanted to ask one more. Since they said that I've heard before that the average age somebody enters into prostitution is about 12 or 13. Is that true?
Well, with the statistics that you're dealing with prostitution, it's hard to get a really strong set of data to say that with confidence.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly have heard that it's common for prostitutes to start being exploited or trafficked when they are 12 or 13.
Mm-hmm.
There's certainly trafficking related data that would reflect that trafficking victims are sometimes trafficked as young as 6, 7, 8 years old. To pinpoint an average age, which averages can sometimes be misleading in and of themselves, is difficult. But I would say without hesitation that there are many minors who are prostituted or trafficked in the United States, and of course globally. It's an enormous problem, especially in Southeast Asian countries.
I want to thank everybody. Andy, thank you so much, and Katie, for agreeing to do this today. I know it's taken a chunk out of your afternoon. I want to thank everybody else who has participated today. I hope that you found it informative. I'm going to put my email in the chat. Most of you should already have my email because I had to share this link in order for you to participate. But if you have any questions, if there are specific documents or websites that you saw in that PowerPoint that you would like to learn more about, I will happily get those to you and share those with you. And then, as Katie had mentioned, please watch the West Virginia Human Trafficking Task Force website. When there are trainings available, we will post those on there. Of course, as members of the QRTs on this, as a member of these QRTs, I will share any future trainings with you all as we get those together. I hope that the Zoom format worked for you. I know it's the way everybody's doing everything now, since we can't really travel too much. Does anybody else have any final questions? Anything else that you want to say, Andy, Katie?
The task force also has a Facebook. So if you prefer social media, you can also follow them on Facebook.
Yep. Thank you all for your engagement on this issue, and let us know if there's any follow-up trainings that we can do with your organizations or agencies.
Okay. Thank you guys so
Thank you
much.
Oh, Stacy, thanks for setting this up. We really appreciate it. And Katie and Andy, thanks again for this awesome presentation. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks. Have a
Welcome.
great day.